Hello, I'm Pierre Shostal. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer who served in posts in Europe and in Africa. And the story I want to tell you is about another Foreign Service officer, Harry Bingham, who is one of the true heroes of our service. So let me tell you that story. Bingham was serving in Marseille, France, in 1940 and 41. And just to recall a little bit of history, this occurred after the French surrender to the Germans in 1940. Following that, the country was divided into two parts, a northern part that was dominated by the Germans, and a southern part that was nominally under the governance of a French regime in Vichy, but it really was controlled by the Germans. And how my story, my family story, fits in with what Harry Bingham did, you need to know a little bit about my family. My father was Jewish. He was born in Vienna into what had been a wealthy family. And my mother was born in Hungary into a Catholic family, and she was moved at a very young age to Vienna. And there, my father and mother met at university. They married, and on their wedding day in 1933, they moved to Paris to set up a business in Paris. Everything was fine in their lives until the war broke out in 1939. My father volunteered for the French Foreign Legion and was sent to North Africa. And my mother and I and my baby brother remained behind in Paris. Fast forward to 1941, by then France was officially out of the war, and my father was demobilized and arrived in Marseille, the big seaport on the Mediterranean. When my mother heard that he was in Marseille, she managed to get counterfeit papers for herself and for me through some very brave members of the resistance to get to Marseille. And we did that. It was quite an adventure, but she managed it. And a few months later, my baby brother was smuggled through by these same people. But there we were, in Marseille, not knowing what was going to happen, where to go. My father's only hope really was with an American cousin. As it happened, while we were there, he received a letter from the American consulate in Marseille inviting him to come to the consulate. So he came to the consulate carrying his precious letter, and that moved him to the top of the line. There's a very long line of people waiting for visas. And he was received by someone he described as a very tall, lanky, friendly young man. And that young man was Harry Bingham. So Bingham told him that he'd received an instruction from Washington to issue him a visitor's visa. Not an immigration visa, but a visitor's visa just for him. So Bingham asked him, will you accept that? And my dad said, well, of course not. I can't abandon my family here. So then Bingham said, well, what if I said I'll issue an immigration visa to you and to your entire family? What would you say? Well, you can imagine the answer there. We finally did manage to get to America via Spain, and we had a wonderful life ever since then. Now, for Harry Bingham, though, the thing that he did was not just for us, but for some 2,500 people, mostly Jews, but also labor union leaders, writers, artists, to whom he also issued visas. And so awful lot of people owed him their lives. But he was punished for what he did by his superiors in Washington, who prematurely ended his assignment in Marseille and sent him to another assignment in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. There, he began investigating and reporting on Nazi activities in that country. And those activities, or rather Harry's initiatives, displeased his superiors again in Washington, who who didn't want any trouble in this hemisphere, as long as America was not yet in the war. Remember, we only became involved in the war in December of 41. So by the end of the war, Bingham realized that his career was over, and he retired. He retired early, went to live with his family on his farm in Connecticut, and had a quiet life there. His heroism was not discovered until many years later, after he died. He died in 1988, and his children learned about what he had done only by going through his papers. They set about trying to make known what their dad had accomplished, and this was recognized finally by the State Department at a ceremony in 2003 that was presided over by Secretary of State Colin Powell, who praised Bingham as an example of someone who was ready to put his life and his career on the line for the sake of what he believed in. It was a very fitting tribute. A few years later, in 2006, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp commemorating what would have been Bingham's 100th anniversary or birthday. So that was, again, a final and belated recognition of Harry Bingham's heroism. So I think that for all of us, Bingham's life, I think, can stand as a shining example of what an individual can do to make a real difference if you stand up for your principles. Thank you. As a personal footnote to this story, I began working a few years ago with a charity that's helping Afghan refugees who used to work for the U.S. military and civilian government in their country as interpreters and support people. They were brought to this country under a special visa program to protect them from the wrath of the Taliban. Now, this work is not easy. It's trying sometimes, but it is rewarding. And when I'm engaged in it, I often think to myself, thank you, Harry.